All right, good evening, folks, and welcome back to day number 37 of the Bible in 365. Today we are taking a look at Leviticus 18, beginning in verse 19, going all the way to Leviticus chapter 21, ending in verse 24. We've got a little bit to talk about today, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, folks, so our reading today picks back up in Leviticus chapter 18. If you remember from yesterday, we talked about essentially Leviticus 18 is a list of guidelines regarding unlawful sexual relations. So there's restrictions and rules against having sex with one's mother, stepmother, sister, half-sister, stepsister, in-laws, aunts, your neighbor's wife. It forbids same-sex relations, bestiality. And so there's this entire list regarding what is not acceptable in the eyes of God when it comes to sexual relations. Also thrown in the chapter here is this command or warning. God states that child sacrifice is a bad idea. So people cannot sacrifice their children to Moloch, which was another god, and this was essentially blasphemy unto the Lord. And then at the end of the chapter, God does explain his reasons, and more or less at the end of chapter 18, it tells us that he banned these practices because they're common practices of the nations that he wants to destroy or crush. And he explains that if the Israelites conquer these lands, it's their duty to eradicate these behaviors so they don't defile the land. The land is supposed to be sacred and holy unto the Lord. And they are supposed to be set apart and not blindly following or copying the behaviors of other nations. So if people were to participate in these behaviors, they would be shunned or put to death because these behaviors were detestable. All right, folks, moving forward to chapter 19 of Leviticus. Within this chapter, essentially there's detailed commands of what God's people is supposed to follow. And it opens up by explaining that the people of Israel are to be holy because God is holy. So God is not asking them to be something that he himself is not. Holiness is rooted in God, and so Israel is commanded to be holy. So Leviticus 19 starts off with all these basic guidelines, which correlate with the commandments, like respecting one's mother and father, respecting the Sabbath, and then following the rituals of sacrifice, not worshiping false idols and prophets. And so it has all these rules and regulations and gives just briefly punishments. Mostly people would be cut off from the community if they didn't follow these things. Next, Leviticus 19 tells us about laws regarding the harvest and how God was commanding them to leave a portion for the poor and the hungry when they harvest their crops. Now, also, the rich and the powerful didn't have it easier. They had to follow the same commands. They didn't have special privilege or advantage over anyone else. Lastly, there's just a couple of random rules that are thrown in. So you have to respect your elders, respect the house of worship, don't turn to mediums, respect non-believers and believers. And then this is reiterated at the end of the chapter. If you disobey, that you will suffer the consequences. All right, folks, moving forward to chapter 20 of Leviticus. In chapter 20, it's mostly repeating the rules, but in addition, it's telling us the punishments for breaking the rules. So God wants the people of Israel to set themselves apart from the other nations and not to blindly follow the other nations. And so they couldn't go to mediums or wizards for advice. This really displeased God, and anyone who did this would be cast out. And then it tells us things like people who curse their parents would be put to death. The death penalty didn't apply to only that, but it applied to those who were guilty of child sacrifice. The parents would be put to death. Also, if you had incest, you would be put to death. And so there's all these lists of things that would result in the death penalty. And most of those are with regards to sex. Once again, Israel is supposed to be holy. They're supposed to be set apart. They're not supposed to become like the other nations. All right, folks, moving forward to Leviticus chapter 21. Here in Leviticus chapter 21, essentially there are rules, and these are aimed specifically at the priests. So they give the priests a general outline of how they can remain holy and effectively lead the people of Israel. Now, within this, once again, there's these instructions on how the priest can remain holy and not disrespect the Lord, how the priest is supposed to essentially hold himself in higher regards than an ordinary man. Essentially, they had to be more focused on the holiness aspect, and this was because they were the one who was presenting the offering before the Lord, and making his holy state was very, very important. So being a priest meant that they had to behave in a different manner than the common person. So essentially, like if a relative was to die, they couldn't come in contact with the body. He couldn't mourn in the same way that a common person could mourn. And there was some exceptions to this rule. So like if a priest's parents, children, or brother had died, then they could be mourned. But any blood relatives could not be mourned. Like if a priest was married and his wife died, he cannot mourn the death of his wife because she's not a blood relative. And so there's just very specific rules and regulations for priests to remain holy and sacred before the Lord. Lastly in here, it talks about how priests weren't allowed to shave their heads. They couldn't rip their garments. They could only marry virgins. And how they had to maintain order in the tabernacle. So this meant that only people who did not have a defect would be allowed to enter the holy sanctuary and give an offering before the Lord. And so these rules were meant to set priests apart from the normal man, and how priests were not only supposed to remain free from sin, but they had to make sure that they weren't behaving in an unholy manner. So this is essentially what Leviticus chapter 21 is talking about, the sanctity or the holiness of priests. All right, folks, I hope that you will join me tomorrow for day number 38 as we take a look at Leviticus chapter 22 and 23. As always, folks, God bless.